Hey everyone, my name is Miss Burr and today I'll be going through your video lecture. So remember, these video lectures will go over important concepts that you will need to know. And again, I covered this in your first video, but these live lectures replace your textbook reading. So if you watch the lectures, you do not need to do your textbook reading. So this is in replacement of the readings, not an injunction. So remember, if you're doing the lectures, you don't need to read the textbook. So you're all good there. So let's begin. So in this video lecture, we're going to be focusing on the Neolithic Revolution, what it was, why it was important, and what impact it had. We're going to go through some major concepts as well as overview at the end and go over a quick timeline. As we go through, remember to pay attention to this little yellow box over here. On each slide, it's actually blue and it's your important vocabulary. So as you're going through the lecture, pay attention to the vocabulary that you might need to know for any tests or quizzes. Also important to remember that as you are going through these lectures, you need to be taking notes as well as writing down any questions you have. That way we can cover any important information you didn't understand during the live lessons. As we go through, pay attention to these symbols at the bottom. The star represents any important information that's going to be on a test. The little brain represents information that's prior knowledge, either from a previous lecture or maybe you should learned it during world geography or in your middle school history classes. So anything like that would be prior knowledge. And then a little bell is just reminder slides, things like that you might not know or you need to know that you may have forgotten or might be a little reminder. Think about this. And then finally, at the bottom of each slide, we will have our objectives. So for our objective today is students will be introduced to the rise of civilization, the shift in society from a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer society to a Neolithic agricultural farmer society. Okay, let's get started. So first off, before we can get into the Neolithic Revolution, we need to first talk about the Paleolithic Revolution. So the Paleolithic, paleo is a Greek word for old, and lithic is a Greek word for stone. And so the Paleolithic period is the Old Stone Age, and that was primarily how people lived for most of early prehistory. And we'll talk a little bit more about what prehistory is during live lecture. But what you need to know is during the Paleolithic period, people were primary hunter-gatherers. This means they gained food and resources through two main avenues. First off, they would hunt, usually birds, animals, fish, reptiles, things like that, or they would gather, like nuts, seeds, and smaller animals like mice or squirrels. They would do this in tribal culture, so people would live in small tribal nations, and these tribal nations would be usually familiar units ruled over by a patriarch or a matriarch, and these would be small, maybe 10 people in total, and they would roam from place to place to follow the animals and the water. In conjunction, Neolithic, which means new or new Stone Age, is a different era because it has two main changes in society. First off, you have the creation and the cultivation of stone tools, such as chisels, bowls, hammers, plowing tools, anything that can be considered a stone working tool, were all stone tools that were developed during this age, as well as you would have agricultural farmers who would use those stone tools to farm and cultivate the land in large groups or cities. This would usually be multiple family units, not just one, and ruled over by kings or other large leaders. So we have a huge shift from our Paleolithic nomadic hunter-gatherers to our Neolithic agricultural farmer that lived in cities. So why did this shift take place? What happened to change the way people lived so drastically? So the big thing was the end of the Ice Age. The end of the Ice Age would be a huge shift in how people lived. So we would have a climate warming all over the globe, and this would do a couple of things. First off, people would begin to no longer huddle together as much. They would begin to spread out and travel because it was not as cold and they could do that. 2, people would begin to farm the land because the land was not as hard. And because it wasn't as hard, it was easy to dig into the land and plant seeds. So there was more abundancy. And then because of this planting in this warming climate, it became more fertile land because there was more warm weather that was great for farming. So how exactly did we get into farming in the first place? Well, you have early experimentation. So what would happen is the hunter-gatherer would throw seeds after gathering. So they would have seeds or nuts that they would eat, and then they would throw the excess onto the ground. And they would come back later and find that those seeds they threw would grow into new plants. And so they developed a hypothesis. If they plant the seeds, they could grow more food. And so they would begin to gather seeds and plant it. And they would use those stone tools to do so, trying a variety of experimentations. For example, in Native American culture, one thing they do is they would take small fish that you couldn't really eat, they were too small to eat, and they would plant it with the seeds. And what would happen is they would notice that the fish would grow healthier crops because of the nutrition. And so they would try different experimentations like this to see what the best way of cultivating the land was. Overall, though, you would have a result of a new way of living in this agricultural type platform. So where exactly would this take place? Well, a lot of early civilizations took place along rivers and waterways. And why was that? First off, you would have river flooding, which would allow for a large portion of fertile land along the edge. So these rivers would flood for a period of time, and then when the waters recede, you have this rich, earthy soil that was perfect for planting. In addition, at this time, there wasn't any wells or a lot of natural reservoirs for water, and so people had to go to the river to get water. And so instead of having to travel back and forth from the river, it was much easier to simply live next to the river. And so people would live next to the river, not only for their water, but the water they would need for their domesticated animals. And again, you would have this process called irrigation that would take place along these waterways, and we'll talk about irrigation a little on the next slide in more detail, but this would only be possible near rivers. And finally, ease of travel. Waterways allowed for easy travel up and down, as well as through the different close natural seas and bodies of water. All of this would take place in an area called the Fertile Crescent. This is a large piece of land in the Middle East that had a variety of rivers, specifically the Nile, as well as the Euphrates and the Tigris River, which would allow for a large amount of fertile land, especially when a lot of the land near it was very dry and deserty, making it unsuitable. So people would gather around these riverheads in order to produce agricultural crops, and this would form into our first early cities and civilizations. So what exactly is agriculture? So first off, agr, which means field in Latin, and cultura, which means growing in Latin, would be the science or practice of farming. An early form of agriculture is irrigation, like I mentioned on the previous slide. Irrigation was this process in which you would have this river that people lived near. And what they would do is they would carve out man-made rivers or canals near the riverhead in which that river water would flow through. And this was important because instead of just having fertile land along the edges like it had before, you would have fertile land in between because that water would flow out into the other fertile areas. This would, in a sense, widen the river and allow for more growing as well as more pastoral lands. So pastoral was a type of animal husbandry or herding in which people would domesticate animals like sheep or goats in order to use them for food, like meat and fat, oil, which was also made in the fat, bones would be used as tools, leather and wool would be made into clothing, and hide and fur would become coverings for homes as well as bodies and even blankets. This animal husbandry was only possible because, unlike with hunter-gatherers, which have to roam from place to place with those animals because they would run out of grass and other grain to eat along the ground, and so they were to move on. Instead, with agricultural farming, people could cultivate a path of grain or path of wheat for the animals to eat, and they would stay in their pasture or their land, which was why it was called pastoral. This process would allow for people to begin to settle in small groups and allow for a surplus of food. So what would happen is, with this agricultural farming, people would have a surplus, which means an excess or extra amount of something, which would allow for more people, because when you have more food, you have a spike in growth population. More people, more food, more people. So with more people, you would form villages. These villages would allow for what is called the division of labor. The division of labor is that instead of everyone going out to hunt or gather, some people would go farm, some people would work in the pastures, there we go, pastures. Some people would then do other things like write or learn how to, or do art, or create items like tools. And this would allow for less labor for individual people. People would have free time to develop culture. This freedom would allow for time for learning, which would allow for experimentation and scholarship. And then scholars would develop writing, culture, art, and law, which is the basis of what we call society. And society would allow for our first civilizations to form. So all of this change would allow for early cities to develop. These villages would form early cities as people began to gather more and more together to farm and raise livestock. They would then also share burdens and create religion and culture. Because of this, there was a need for law and order. Because remember, before in the Paleolithic period, people formed familiar tribes with chiefs, usually a patriarch or matriarch. So it was a small unit. You didn't really need any law and order. The chief would say, do this, don't do this, and people would be like, cool. But now in the Neolithic period, you would have multiple family units with different gods, different cultures, different belief systems. And so they would need a new type of leader, one who could rule over everybody. And this is how we got our first kings. These are people who would rule by power, wealth, or status, usually tied to some cultural god. And we'll talk more about kingdoms later on. One of our first ancient cities we would have would be Samar. Samar would be an ancient village that formed in the Middle East and become one of the first cities that formed the early civilization of Mesopotamia. And we'll talk more about Samar in our next video lecture. So timeline-wise, let's just think through. In around the 15 BCE, we have the end of the Ice Age. By 10,000 BCE, humans began to shift from hunting-gathering to agricultural society. And by 6,000 BCE, we see our first cities forming. Overall, we see a massive shift over almost 5,000 years, creating a huge shift from hunter-gatherers to agricultural farmers. And this is our Neolithic Revolution. So remember, with the warming of the climates, you would have agricultural change, population growth, forming of cities, division of labor, scholars, laws, and kings would form, and when you have the creation of the first civilizations. Before you go, think back on our term revolution. Revolution is from the Latin word revolve, which means to roll back. So my challenge question to you is, was the Neolithic period a revolution? Why or why not? Think about this question and complete your post-lecture assessment. And remember, if you need anything, feel free to email me, call me, or text me, or come to my office hours on Thursdays. Okay, have a great day, y'all, and I will see you in our next video lecture. Bye.